The idea is the reason why the world is so disorderly is because you've got all, now with the Cold War gone, you've got all these ethnic groups killing each other and so on. Well, as usual, it's always a good idea to start by asking about the facts. Whenever you hear anything said very confidently, the first thing that should come to mind is, wait a minute, is that true?
My city is still breathing, but barely, it's true. Through buildings gone missing like teeth, the sidewalks are watching me think about you. Sparkled with broken glass, I'm back with scars to show. Back with the streets I know will never take me anywhere but here. I know we meet here for our dress rehearsal to say I wanted it this way. Wait for the year to drown. Spring forward, fall back down. I'm trying not to wonder where you are.
Thanks. I just got back from Brazil, where they don't have any fire codes. And if you think this is uncomfortable, you should see a meeting there. People packed so tight that it was a good question whether the oxygen level would suffice. Fortunately, there wasn't a fire. There would have been a huge catastrophe. Well, the title, you noticed, had a question mark after it. And the reason for the question mark is that whatever's been happening for the past several months and is going on now, and however you evaluate it, like it, hate it, whatever, it's pretty clear that it cannot be a war on terror. And that's, in fact, that's close to a logical necessity, at least if we accept certain pretty elementary assumptions, certain principles. So let me try to make those clear at the outset. The first principle guideline, if you like, is that we ought to, I will try, and I think we should, bend over backwards to give the benefit of the doubt to the United States government whenever it's possible. So if there's any dispute about how to interpret something, we'll assume they're right. The second guideline is that we should take rather seriously, very seriously, the pronouncements of leadership, especially when they're made with great sincerity and emotion. So, for example, when George Bush tells us that he's the most devout Christian since the apostles, we should believe him, take him at his word, and we should therefore conclude that he certainly has memorized over and over again in his Bible reading classes and in church the famous definition of hypocrite that's given in the Gospels. Namely, the hypocrite is the person who applies to others standards that he refuses to apply to himself. So if you're not a hypocrite, you assume that if something is right for us, it's right for them. And if it's wrong when they do it, it's wrong when we do it. That's really elementary. And I assume the President would agree, and all of his admirers as well. So those are the principles I'd like to start with. Well, just side comment, I mean, unless we can rise to that minimal level of moral integrity, we should at least stop talking about things like human rights and right and wrong and good and evil and all such highfalutin things, because all of our talk should be dismissed, in fact dismissed with complete repugnance, unless we can at least rise to that minimal level. I think that's obvious, and I'd hope there'd be agreement on that too. Well, with that much in place, just that much for background, let me formulate a thesis. The thesis is that we are all total hypocrites on any issue relating to terrorism. Now, let me clarify the notion we. I mean, by we, I mean people like us, people who have a high degree of privilege, of training, resources, access to information, for whom it's pretty easy to find out the truth about things if we want to, if we decide that that's our vocation. And in the case in question, you really don't have to dig very deep. It's all right on the surface. So I mean, when I say we, I mean that category. And I definitely mean to include myself in we, because I've never proposed that our leaders be subjected to the kinds of punishment that I've recommended for enemies. So that's hypocrisy. In fact, if there are people who escape it, I really don't know them, haven't come across them. It's a very powerful culture. It's hard to escape its grasp. So that's thesis number one. We're all total hypocrites on the matter of, in the sense of the Gospels, on the matter of terrorism. The second thesis is stronger, namely that the first thesis is so obvious that it takes real effort to miss it. And in fact, I should go home right now because it is obvious. Nevertheless, let me continue and say why I think both theses are correct. Well, to begin with, what is terrorism? Got to say something about that. That's supposed to be a really tough question. Academic seminars and graduate philosophy programs and so on. Very vexing, complex question. However, in accordance with the guidelines that I mentioned, I think there's a simple answer. Namely, we just take the official U.S. definition of terrorism, since we're accepting the pronouncements of our leaders literally. So let's take their definition. In fact, that's what I've always done when I've been writing about terrorism for the last 20 years or so. Just accept the official definition. So, for example, a simple and important case is in a U.S. Army manual in 1984, which defines terrorism as the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature. Well, that seems simple. Appropriate. Particularly good choice because of the timing, 1984. 1984, you'll recall, was the time when the Reagan administration was waging a war against terrorism, particularly what they called state-supported international terrorism, a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in the modern age. Happen to be quoting George Shultz, who was the administration moderate. Another guideline is we'll keep to the moderates, not the extremists. So that's 1984. Reagan had come into office a couple years earlier. His administration had immediately declared that the war against terrorism would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy, and they identified two regions as the source of this plague by depraved opponents of civilization itself, Central America and the Middle East. And there was quite wide agreement on that. So in 1985, for example, every year Associated Press has a poll of editors on the most important story of the year. And in 1985, the winner was Middle East terrorism. So they agreed. Right towards the end of that year, 1985, Shimon Peres, Israeli Prime Minister, came to Washington, and Reagan and Peres denounced the evil scourge of terrorism, referring to the Middle East. Scholarship and experts also agreed. There's a huge